The cannon's roar echoed across the Mississippi River as dawn broke on May 18, 1863. From his position on the eastern bluffs, Major General Ulysses S. Grant surveyed the formidable Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, a city perched upon steep bluffs that commanded the great river below. The Union commander knew that whoever controlled Vicksburg controlled the Mississippi, and whoever controlled the Mississippi would ultimately decide the fate of the American Civil War. "Vicksburg is the key," President Abraham Lincoln had remarked months earlier. "The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket." Grant's army had marched over 200 miles in less than 3 weeks, fighting and winning 5 battles along the way. They had cut themselves off from their supply lines, living off the land in enemy territory in one of the most daring military campaigns in American history. Now, after surrounding the Confederate fortress city, Grant prepared to take Vicksburg by storm. Across the defensive lines, Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton commanded nearly 30,000 Confederate defenders. The city's natural defenses made it a formidable target: steep bluffs to the north, swampland to the south, and a network of earthworks, trenches, and artillery positions encircling the eastern approaches. Pemberton had boasted that Vicksburg will never fall, and as the morning fog lifted on May 18th, he intended to make good on that promise. Inside the city, civilians had already endured months of hardship. Food was scarce, and Union gunboats had periodically shelled the city since the previous summer. Many residents had taken to living in caves dug into the hillsides, prairie dog villages, they called them, seeking refuge from the incoming artillery fire. At 10 o'clock in the E.S.I. morning on May 19th, the Union assault began. Grant ordered General William T. Sherman's corps to attack the Stockade Redan, a formidable defensive position north of the city. Sherman's men charged across open ground, under withering fire from Confederate rifles and artillery. The attackers reached the base of the Confederate fortifications but could advance no further against the deadly fire. By afternoon, Sherman called off the assault with over 1,000 Union casualties littering the field. "The works are too strong to be taken by storm," a blood-spattered Captain James Morgan wrote in his field diary that evening. "The rebel works are formidable beyond anything we expected." From the Western Campaign, Grant's Path to Victory, Harper's Weekly, July 1863. Undeterred, Grant ordered a larger, more coordinated assault on May 22nd. At 10 in the morning, following a furious artillery bombardment, Union forces attacked along a 3-mile front. At the railroad redoubt, troops from Illinois and Wisconsin planted their flags on the Confederate parapet, engaging in vicious hand-to-hand combat with bayonets and rifle butts. Further north, a Union regiment briefly penetrated the Confederate line at the Jackson Road before being thrown back. The most dramatic moment came when troops of the 22nd Iowa Infantry broke through at a position known as the 2nd Texas Lunette. Sergeant Joseph Griffith and a dozen men fought their way into the Confederate fortification, capturing a section of the trench line. For a brief moment, it seemed the Union forces might secure a foothold, but Confederate reinforcements quickly sealed the breach. By nightfall, the second assault had also failed. Union casualties numbered nearly 3,000 men. The fields before Vicksburg were covered with the dead and wounded, their cries echoing through the night. As stretcher-bearers worked feverishly to recover the injured under cover of darkness, Grant came to a grim realization: Vicksburg could not be taken by direct assault. Calling his generals together in the flickering light of a tent lamp, Grant announced his new strategy. "Gentlemen, we will siege them out." As May turned to June, the character of the Vicksburg campaign transformed from rapid maneuver to patient strangulation. Grant's army settled into siege lines stretching more than 15 miles, completely encircling the Confederate stronghold. Each day, Union soldiers dug their trenches closer to the Confederate defenses in a methodical war of spades and picks. "The works grow daily," wrote Lieutenant Colonel Charles LeBruzon of the 15th Mississippi. "The Yankees are like moles, always digging and advancing their lines. They have established batteries on every prominent point and keep up an unceasing fire upon our works in the city." As recorded in Under Siege, The Vicksburg Memoirs, Southern Historical Review, 1868. For the Union soldiers, life in the siege lines became a grinding routine of danger and monotony. By day, They endured the scorching summer heat, often reaching over 90 degrees. Sharpshooters on both sides made it lethal to expose oneself above the parapets. Men fired through small loopholes or used periscopes fashioned from mirrors to observe enemy movements. At night, work parties extended the trenches forward using a technique called sapping, digging zigzag approaches toward the Confederate lines. Major General William Tecumseh Sherman observed the psychological impact of the siege on his men. The sound of picks and shovels has replaced the roar of cannon and musketry. Our men have learned patience, but their determination grows stronger with each passing day. Behind the Union lines, an enormous logistical operation supplied the besieging army. Steamboats arrived daily at the landing on the Yazoo River, bringing rations, ammunition, and reinforcements. Grant's supply chain now stretched back to Cairo, Illinois, nearly 500 miles to the north. The siege army swelled to over 70,000 men as additional units arrived from across the Western Theater. Inside Vicksburg, conditions deteriorated rapidly. By mid-June, rations were severely reduced. Soldiers received a daily allowance of just 4 ounces of bacon and a small portion of cornmeal or peas. As food stocks dwindled further, the garrison turned to more desperate measures. Mule meat appeared on mess tables, selling for $1 per pound. Rats became a delicacy, with soldiers calling them squirrels to make the meat more palatable. Martha Balfour, wife of a Confederate officer, wrote in her diary on June 15th, "We are living on pea bread and rice. The soldiers fare worse. Many have not tasted meat in weeks. Everyone is thin and hollow-eyed. Still, there is no talk of surrender." The civilian population suffered terribly under the constant bombardment. More than 500 buildings were damaged or destroyed by Union artillery fire. The city's 4,000 civilians crowded into nearly 500 caves dug into the hillsides. Inside these damp, cramped quarters, families attempted to maintain some semblance of normal life, holding religious services, celebrating birthdays, and even hosting occasional social gatherings. Emma Balfour, a prominent Vicksburg resident, described life underground. "The shells have been falling around us like hail. We are living in a cave that my husband had dug in the side of the hill. Our dwelling has been struck twice by fragments of shells. How long can we endure this terrible existence?" By the end of June, the Union approach trenches had advanced to within yards of the Confederate defenses at several points. Grant ordered his engineers to begin tunneling operations, planning to detonate explosive charges beneath the Confederate fortifications. The defenders, aware of the mining operations, dug countermines, listening posts where soldiers pressed their ears to the ground, straining to hear the sound of Union picks and shovels. As June came to a close, Pemberton faced the grim reality that no relief was coming. His messages to General Joseph E. Johnston, commanding Confederate forces in central Mississippi, went unanswered. His army was starving, and his ammunition was running low. The noose around Vicksburg was drawing ever tighter. On June 25, 1863, a deafening roar shook the earth beneath Vicksburg. At precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Union engineers detonated 2,200 pounds of black powder in a tunnel dug beneath the 3rd Louisiana Redan, one of the strongest points in the Confederate defense line. The massive explosion blew a crater 50 feet in diameter and 20 feet deep, obliterating the Confederate fortification and burying many of its defenders. Before the dust had settled, the Union's 45th Illinois Infantry, known as the Lead Mine Regiment, charged forward into the smoking crater. What followed was some of the most savage fighting of the entire Civil War. Union soldiers clambered up the steep sides of the crater only to meet determined Confederate defenders, who had rushed to seal the breach. In the confined space, men fought with bayonets, rifle butts, and even bare hands. "It was murder, not war," wrote Sergeant James Houghton of the 45th Illinois. "The rebels stood above us on the crater rim, firing down into our mass. We could go neither forward nor backward. Men fell by the dozens, their blood turning the earth into mud beneath our feet." From the Vicksburg Campaign, an eyewitness history, Atlantic Monthly, September 1863. Colonel Jasper Maltby, commanding the Union assault force, was wounded twice but continued to lead his men forward. For over 3 hours, the battle raged in and around the crater. By nightfall, the Confederates had held their line, though at terrible cost. The failed assault cost Grant nearly 500 casualties. The crater battle represented the last major Union offensive action of the siege. Grant returned to his strategy of patient strangulation, recognizing that time was on his side. Union engineers began work on new mines at several points along the line, creating a constant psychological pressure on the defenders. Away from the front lines, Union forces strengthened their grip on the surrounding countryside. Cavalry raids led by Colonel Benjamin Grierson disrupted Confederate attempts to gather supplies or communicate with the outside world. Any hope that Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston might launch a relief expedition faded with each passing day inside the besieged city. The situation grew desperate. By the end of June, the daily ration had been reduced to just 2 ounces of bacon and a small portion of cornbread per man. Scurvy and dysentery ravaged the weakened garrison. The military hospital, operating in the courthouse, overflowed with wounded and sick soldiers. Medical supplies ran low, with surgeons performing amputations without anesthesia, and dressing wounds with cloth torn from the clothing of the dead. Civilians faced equally dire conditions. A young woman named Emma Crutcher wrote in her diary, "We had soup made from a tablespoon of bacon and a cup of dried peas today, divided among 5 people. Mother says we must keep our spirits up, but it is hard when your stomach is always empty." The bombardment continued without pause, day and night. Union gunboats on the Mississippi fired their heavy guns into the city, while land-based artillery maintained a constant barrage. An estimated 4,000 shells fell on Vicksburg every day. The psychological impact of the ceaseless shelling, combined with starvation, began to erode Confederate morale. Desertion became a growing problem for Pemberton. Soldiers slipped away under cover of darkness, crossing the siege lines to surrender to Union pickets. Those caught attempting to desert faced court-martial and potential execution, but even these harsh measures failed to stem the tide. By the beginning of July, Pemberton was losing dozens of men each night. On July 1st, a remarkable scene unfolded along portions of the siege lines. After weeks of deadly hostility, informal truces broke out between opposing pickets. Union and Confederate soldiers, separated by only yards of contested ground, began to exchange greetings, newspapers, and what few luxuries they possessed. Coffee from the Union side traded for tobacco from the Confederates. Captain Walter Powell of the 5th Missouri Confederate Infantry described one such encounter. A Yankee officer called out asking if we would like some coffee. When I answered in the affirmative, he tossed a small sack across no man's land. We sent back what tobacco we could muster. For a brief moment, we were not enemies, but simply hungry, tired men, far from home. These unauthorized fraternizations were quickly broken up by officers on both sides, but they revealed a growing sense among the defenders that the end was near. Pemberton, recognizing the inevitable, began to consider terms of surrender. The morning of July 3, 1863, dawned hot and humid over Vicksburg. From his headquarters in a commandeered plantation house, General John C. Pemberton surveyed reports from his division commanders. The news was uniformly grim: rations exhausted, ammunition running critically low, and over a third of the garrison unfit for duty due to wounds, illness, or starvation. The previous evening, Pemberton had called a council of war with his 4 division commanders. The question before them was stark: continue resistance or seek terms of surrender. After hours of somber deliberation, the verdict was unanimous. Further resistance would only result in needless suffering and loss of life. "Our men have demonstrated their courage beyond question," General John Bowen reportedly stated. "They have endured privations that would break most armies, but courage without food cannot sustain a siege indefinitely." At 10 o'clock in the morning, white flags appeared along the Confederate lines. The sudden silence after 47 days of continuous bombardment created an eerie calm. Union soldiers stood on their parapets staring in disbelief at the flags of truce fluttering in the summer breeze. A small party of Confederate officers, led by General John Bowen and Colonel Lewis Montgomery, rode out under a flag of truce toward the Union lines. They carried a letter from Pemberton, requesting a meeting to discuss terms of capitulation. The Confederate messengers were escorted to General Grant's headquarters. Grant, dressed in his customary plain uniform without insignia of rank, read Pemberton's message with characteristic stoicism. To his staff's surprise, he agreed to meet Pemberton that afternoon between the lines to discuss surrender terms. "I have no interest in humiliating a brave enemy," Grant told his generals, "but the surrender must be unconditional." At 3 o'clock that afternoon, one of the most famous meetings of the Civil War took place. Under an oak tree between the lines, Grant and Pemberton met face to face. They were old acquaintances, having served together in the Mexican War 16 years earlier. Now they faced each other as commanders of opposing armies. The meeting was brief and initially tense. Pemberton, still proud despite his desperate situation, rejected Grant's initial demand for unconditional surrender. After a few minutes of fruitless discussion, the generals agreed that their subordinates would continue the negotiations while they returned to their respective headquarters. Throughout the evening, messages passed back and forth between the lines. Grant, showing unexpected flexibility, modified his terms. Instead of marching into captivity, the Confederate garrison would be paroled, allowed to go free after pledging not to take up arms again until formally exchanged. This practical solution would spare the Union Army the logistical burden of transporting and feeding 30,000 prisoners. The negotiations revealed Grant's pragmatic genius, noted historian Bruce Catton. By paroling the garrison rather than taking them prisoner, he freed his army for immediate operations elsewhere, while effectively removing the Confederate defenders from the war. From Grant's masterpiece, the Vicksburg Campaign, National Historical Review, 1876. As night fell over the siege lines, soldiers on both sides anticipated the end of their long ordeal. In the Confederate trenches, the mood was somber, but also tinged with relief. Many defenders had not tasted meat in weeks and had been subsisting on bread made from ground peas and corn husks. Private William Chambers of the 27th Louisiana Infantry wrote, "When word came down the line that surrender negotiations were underway, I felt neither shame nor defeat, only gratitude that the suffering might soon end. We have done our duty. No men could have done more." Through the night, Pemberton consulted with his commanders. Some argued for continuing resistance until July 4th, believing surrender on Independence Day would be especially humiliating. Pemberton, however, recognized that every additional day meant more suffering for his men and the civilians of Vicksburg. Shortly before midnight, Pemberton sent his acceptance of Grant's terms. The 47-day siege would end the following morning, July 4th, 1863, coinciding with the nation's independence celebration. At 10 o'clock on the morning of July 4th, 1863, the formal surrender of Vicksburg began. Under a cloudless summer sky, Confederate soldiers marched out from their entrenchments and formed ranks on the grassy plain before the city. Regiment by regiment, they stacked their arms, placed their battle flags atop the rifle pyramids, and then returned to their camps as paroled prisoners. Union General James McPherson, an eyewitness to the ceremony, later wrote, "It was a scene to stir conflicting emotions in any American breast. Here were brave men, now defeated but not dishonored, laying down the arms they had wielded with such determination. Many wept openly as they parted with the flags they had followed through so many battles." From Victory on the Mississippi, Harper's Weekly, August 1863. Grant, conscious of the dignity of his defeated foe, had ordered his men to avoid any demonstrations of triumph. "The Confederates are our countrymen again," he told his officers. "Treat them with the respect due to brave soldiers." Not all Union soldiers followed these instructions. As the 23rd Indiana Infantry marched into Vicksburg, they struck up the battle cry of freedom and other patriotic songs. However, when they encountered the weakened, hollow-eyed defenders and gaunt civilians, many fell silent, moved by compassion for their suffering former enemies. By noon, the stars and stripes flew over the Vicksburg courthouse. Admiral David, Porter's gunboat fleet, which had maintained the river blockade throughout the siege, steamed proudly past the city, their flags flying. For the first time since the war began, the Mississippi River was under complete Union control. The human toll of the surrender became immediately apparent. Union soldiers, well supplied throughout the siege, were shocked by the condition of both Confederate soldiers and civilians. Relief operations began almost immediately. Union commissary wagons distributed rations to the starving population. Military physicians established aid stations to treat the sick and wounded of both sides. "I have seen battlefields covered with dead," wrote Union Chaplain John Eaton, "but nothing has affected me like seeing the children of Vicksburg rush upon our supply wagons, fighting for scraps of bread and meat. This is war in its most terrible aspect." The surrendered Confederate garrison numbered approximately 29,000 men, though nearly a third were unfit for duty due to wounds or illness. In addition to the men, Grant's forces captured over 60,000 rifles, over 170 artillery pieces, and enormous quantities of ammunition, material the Confederacy could ill afford to lose. Inside the city, Union soldiers explored the cave dwellings that had sheltered Vicksburg civilians during the bombardment. The caves revealed the ingenuity of desperation. Some were furnished with salvaged furniture, had crude ventilation systems, and even displayed family portraits. On dirt walls, several caves contained recent graves where residents had buried loved ones killed during the siege. Martha Batchelor, a Vicksburg resident, recorded her impressions of the Union occupation. "The Yankees have behaved better than we expected. They seem as astonished at our condition as we are at their abundance. A Union captain gave my children hardtack and sugar, the first sweet things they have tasted in months." For the Union soldiers who had endured their own hardships during the long campaign, entry into Vicksburg brought mixed emotions. They had marched hundreds of miles, fought in scorching heat and drenching rain, dug trenches under enemy fire, and lost many comrades. Now standing in the captured stronghold, they could begin to comprehend the magnitude of their achievement. Sergeant Osborne Oldroyd of the 20th Ohio Infantry wrote home, "We have done what some said was impossible. Vicksburg has fallen, and with it, I believe, the fortune of the rebellion. The Mississippi River now flows unvexed to the sea, as Father Abraham wished." The political impact of Vicksburg's surrender was immediately recognized in both Washington and Richmond. Coming one day after the Confederate defeat at Gettysburg, the fall of Vicksburg represented a devastating 1-2 punch to Confederate hopes. President Lincoln, upon receiving the news, reportedly exclaimed, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." In a strategic sense, the Confederacy had been cut in two. The trans-Mississippi states of Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas were now isolated from the rest of the Confederacy. Valuable supplies from these regions, particularly Texas beef that had sustained Confederate armies, could no longer reach the eastern theater of war. As news of Vicksburg's surrender spread across the nation in the early days of July 1863, few failed to recognize its significance. Combined with the Confederate defeat at Gettysburg the previous day, the fall of Vicksburg marked what many historians would later identify as the turning point of the American Civil War. President Abraham Lincoln, who had long recognized the strategic importance of the Mississippi River, wrote to General Grant, "You were right and I was wrong. The country owes you a great debt of gratitude for this victory which has opened the Mississippi River." The campaign's impact went far beyond the immediate military victory. Grant's Vicksburg campaign would be studied in military academies worldwide for generations to come. His bold decision to cut loose from his supply lines, maneuvering between two Confederate armies and living off the land while defeating the enemy in detail, represented a revolution in military strategy. Lieutenant General James Longstreet, one of the Confederacy's finest commanders, later acknowledged, "The surrender at Vicksburg was catastrophic. I consider it the most decisive campaign of the war. Before Vicksburg, we had hope of foreign recognition and ultimate victory. After Vicksburg, we fought to salvage honor from inevitable defeat." For General Ulysses S. Grant, the victory at Vicksburg established him as the Union's premier commander. President Lincoln, who had cycled through numerous unsuccessful generals, finally found in Grant a commander who understood that the object of war was not geographical positions, but the destruction of enemy armies. "Grant is my man," Lincoln told his cabinet, "and I am his for the rest of the war." In October 1863, Grant was appointed commander of all Union forces in the Western Theater. By March 1864, Lincoln would call him east to take command of all Union armies as lieutenant general, a rank previously held only by George Washington. For the defeated Confederates, the aftermath of Vicksburg brought mixed fates. General Pemberton, already distrusted by some Southerners because of his Pennsylvania birth, faced harsh criticism for the surrender. Though later exchanged, he never again held significant command, eventually resigning his general's commission to serve as a lieutenant colonel of artillery. The paroled Confederate soldiers experienced a confusing aftermath. Technically free but bound by oath not to take up arms until formally exchanged, many simply went home, considering their war service concluded. Confederate authorities, desperate for manpower, eventually declared the paroles void on technical grounds and recalled many of these men to service, a controversial decision that led many to desert rather than return to ranks. For the citizens of Vicksburg, the surrender brought immediate relief from starvation, but introduced the realities of life under occupation. Union forces established a military government that would control the city for the remainder of the war. Some residents accommodated themselves to the new reality, while others maintained fierce Confederate loyalty, earning Vicksburg the nickname, the Gibraltar of Resistance. The city itself bore the physical scars of the siege for decades. Unexploded shells remained embedded in buildings and hills, occasionally claiming victims years after the war ended. The extensive network of trenches, tunnels, and artillery positions gradually eroded, but remained visible well into the 20th century. No city paid a heavier price for the Confederacy, wrote historian Shelby Foote. Vicksburg endured bombardment, starvation, and occupation with remarkable fortitude. In the East's crucible of siege, a community's character was both revealed and transformed. From the Civil War. A Narrative. Random House Historical Press, 1958. In the decades following the Civil War, the Vicksburg battlefield became one of the nation's most sacred military parks. Veterans from both sides returned to walk the ground where they had once fought as enemies. Former Union and Confederate soldiers clasped hands over the same earthworks where they had once tried to kill each other. At a reunion held 50 years after the siege, elderly veterans from Illinois and Mississippi shared meals and memories beneath the same oak tree where Grant and Pemberton had met to discuss surrender terms. "We were enemies then, but are friends now," declared former Confederate Captain Thomas Henderson. The courage shown on both sides belongs now to our united country. The legacy of Vicksburg extends far beyond military history. The campaign represented a turning point not just in the Civil War, but in American identity. The shared sacrifice of Union and Confederate soldiers, the suffering of civilians, and the eventual reconciliation all contributed to the nation's understanding of itself. Today, the preserved battlefield at Vicksburg National Military Park stands as a monument not only to military strategy and tactics, but to the resilience of the American spirit. The 47-day siege tested the limits of human endurance on both sides. In that crucible of fire and privation, enemies gained a grudging respect that would, in time, help heal the wounds of a divided nation. As the sun set on July 4, 1863, a Union private wrote in his diary words that would prove prophetic. "Today we have won a great victory, but the greater victory will come when these southern states are truly reunited with the Union, not just by force of arms but by reconciliation of hearts."